We're moving on to experiment 4 now. You can find experiment 4 in your practical booklet on page 9. And experiment 4 is working out the non-metal part of the compound, still working out the non-metal part of the compound, but now we're looking at the sulphate test. Previously, experiment 3, we looked at identifying whether the non-metal part was carbonate. If it's not carbonate, then we need to do another test. If it's carbonate, we know that we have CO3 as the non-metal part of our compound. But if there is no bubbling and fizzing, we can move on to a second test called the sulphate test. Now, sulphate is actually a little group of atoms, a sulfur and 4 oxygens forming the sulphate. Once again, we're talking about ionic compounds with a metal and a non-metal part. So if we have sodium sulphate, again, sodium is the metal part. We can determine that through the flame test and the hydroxide test. If we then did a carbonate test on sodium sulphate, we wouldn't get any bubbling or fizzing, but we wouldn't know what the non-metal part is. All that we know is that it's not carbonate. So we move on and we try the sulphate test. As I said, sulphate is a sulfur and 4 oxygens. I'm looking in your notes at experiment number 4, and the background says the sulphate group consists of 1 sulfur and 4 oxygen atoms. In this test, the sulphate group retains its identity, but a reaction occurs in which it swaps partners, and barium sulphate is produced. And this is the important part. Barium sulphate is white and it's not soluble. In other words, it doesn't dissolve. It will appear as a white powdery precipitate in the test tube. So when we do these reactions, we're looking for a white precipitate. And if there is a white precipitate, then we know that our non-metal part is sulphate. And that's the sulphate test. Once again, I'm going to perform these experiments on some known substances, which you can find in page 9. We're going to test 5 knowns. And then we'll come back and we'll test 5 unknowns to determine whether we think that they are or they are not sulfates. We're now undertaking the sulphate test. This is experiment 4. We're testing our knowns. This is experiment 4 on page 9. You'll notice in the results table, we're testing 5 sulfates. We're going to test sodium sulphate, nickel sulphate, potassium sulphate, zinc sulphate, and copper sulphate. Now, I've already added these to our test tube, and I've added a little bit of hydrochloric acid, which just helps with the reaction. They're all ready to go. And I'm going to add some barium chloride. Now, we need to be careful with barium chloride. It is a little bit poisonous, so we need to be careful. If I get it on my skin, I'm going to wash my hands immediately. I'm wearing my lab coat. I've got my glasses on again. But I'll add a few drops of barium chloride to each of these. They are all sulfates, and we will expect to see a white precipitate in each of these because that's the sulfate test. If there is a sulfate present, we get a white precipitate when we add barium chloride. So let's test these. First of all, sodium sulfate. If we put some barium chloride in here, I think you can see we've got a nice white precipitate that's formed. Again, I've got a black background. Hopefully you can see the white precipitate. Precipitate means there's an undissolved solid suspended in the solution. The next is nickel. Nickel's that lovely green color. We add some barium chloride to our nickel. And again, you can hopefully see that we've got a white solid that's formed. There's still a bit of the nickel present, so it's a bit of a green tinge, but there's a white precipitate that's formed. We'll expect a white precipitate for all of these because they are all sulfates. We go on, we test now potassium sulfate. And again, we get a really lovely white precipitate being formed, quite cloudy. 2 more, zinc sulfate. Once again, we get a white precipitate. And our final one is copper sulfate. Copper's got that very characteristic blue color to it. And we get a white precipitate forming with our copper sulfate. So each of those are sulfates. So we expect a white precipitate because sulfates precipitate out to be white when we add barium chloride.